Where do I see myself in 5 years? That's a great question. I mean, if I'm honest, right where you're sitting now.
Dear applicant, thank you for your interest in the position. We received a record number of applications for this job. You were not successful at this time. Due to the large numbers of applications, we do not offer any feedback. Better luck next time, and all the best in your future job search.
Well, I'm just really passionate about excellence in business.
Dear applicant, thank you for your interest in the position. We received a record number of applications for this job. You are not successful at this time. Due to the large numbers of applications, we do not offer any feedback. Better luck next time, and all the best in your future job search.
I'm a real team player, but I also work well under my own initiative. I think key performance indicators are an incredibly important analytic for understanding future performance.
Dear applicant, thank you for your interest in the position. We received a record number of applications for this job. You were not successful at this time. Due to the large numbers of applications, we do not offer any feedback. Better luck next time, and all the best in your future job search.
Dear applicant, thank you for your interest in this position. We received a record number of applications for this job. You are not successful at this time. Due to the large numbers of applications, we do not offer any feedback. Better luck next time, and all the best in your future job search.
Dear applicant, thank you for your interest in the position. We received a record number of applications for this job. You were not successful at this time. Dear, due to the large numbers of applications, we do not offer any feedback. Better luck next time, and all the best in your future job search. At this time. Better luck next time, due to the large numbers of applications, we do not offer any feedback. Better luck next time, and all the best for your future job search.
And what would I do to get this job? Anything.
Welcome to Omnicore. And congratulations! You are now part of the global Omnicore family. For centuries, we've been hard at work bringing the world closer and closer together. Through our partner organizations and subsidiary companies, we have a presence in almost every community, in every home, and in every life. You may not realize it, but you've used our products, bought our services, and supported the global Omnicore family. That's our mission here at Omnicore, to bring you the highest quality products and services, whether you like it or not. Now you get to be a part of that mission. You get to help Omnicore change the world. You get to help build a powerful global institution. Remember, when you work at Omnicore, you're family. And that comes with some pretty big privileges, as well as some big responsibilities. But if one thing's for sure, it's that life with Omnicore is pretty great. We think you're gonna love working here. And you'd better, because just remember, you're here forever.
Let's start with a question. What's horror for? On a certain view, the form is useful for exploring the anxieties of a particular cultural moment. So we find specific things scary at specific times for specific historical reasons. Think of all of those creature features and B-movies and invasion films during the Cold War, for example. And horror is very in at the moment, for some reason.
2020 has not been a kind year.
So what I want to do is talk about a certain kind of horror which I don't think has gotten enough attention over the last decade or so, and what this subset of horror tells us about the culture that we live in and what the world we currently inhabit seems to think about a particular kind of work. As Kathi Weeks points out in their book, The Problem with Work, we spend more time in work, preparing for work, training for work, and most importantly, recovering from work than almost any other activity. Given that we live in a world that expects us to work in order to, stay alive, then the question of work, what kind of work is available, and whether we should be structuring our lives around work becomes incredibly important. And that's just before we get into work. We're shepherded into workplaces through impersonal forces. At the most basic level, we need to buy food, we need healthcare and housing, and all of the other necessities of life. But to quote Weeks, as soon as we find ourselves in the workplace, we find ourselves enmeshed in the direct and personal relations of rulers and ruled. All of this impacts how people relate to one another. So much of modern work is predicated upon antagonisms. If work is something that you may lose access to, or depending on circumstances, may never get access to in the first place, and you need to keep work in order to live, then everyone else is a threat. Those aren't friends. Those aren't colleagues in your office. Those are your competition. Maybe the biggest problem is that so much of the work that happens in those offices, all of those petty squabbles with the boss, presentations, reports, the endless emails, just none of it feels very meaningful. In a famous essay originally published in 2013 and then released as a full-length book a few years later, the anthropologist David Graeber argued that an astonishingly large proportion of people had jobs which were not just pointless, but that they themselves knew had no real meaning. According to Graeber, nearly 4 out of every 10 people in all of those offices, in all of those workplaces, are sitting there knowing that there's just no point to what they do. A good example of this is something really recent. In the COVID-19 lockdown of 2020, the UK government wanted to encourage people to stop working at home and start working again from their offices. Now, if you are a brand that depends upon commuters, this is an opportunity. So the cleaning company Dettol released an advert that would run on the London Underground designed to target these commuters. This image went massively viral for a simple reason. It was honest about the conditions of so much of the work that goes on in so many of these offices all across London and so many other cities just like it all around the world. The boss's jokes, plastic plants, seeing your second family. Don't you love this? The advert seemed to scream. Don't you miss this? This isn't aspirational advertising. This is horrifying. This is a nightmare. Trying to persuade commuters to come back to the office simply served to expose just how much of the work that goes on in the office is a grinding performance that we're expected to act as if we're happy to do. In its coercion and its banality, the office is something horrifying. It's a monster that we're expected to love, that feeds on time, attention, and effort, leeching it out of the very bodies of the people that work there. So, if the office is a site of horror, what kind of horror is being explored there? Exam is a small, low-budget horror film from 2009, which, in a way, serves as a prototype for the office horror which reaches its apex a few years later. The premise is really simple. 8 candidates go into a small room to sit a job interview exam, and as Colin Salmon explains to them, the point is to try and win a job with a massively powerful pharmaceutical company who have the monopoly on the cure for a deadly pandemic which is raging around the globe. I love fiction. The catch is they can't leave until the time has expired, and obviously as the time goes by the tension ramps up and, well, things don't go well for any of them. The film itself is basically an object lesson in how the concept of work encourages us to see one another as a potential threat. If you stop and think about this, it is a little bit odd. After all, the film explains that none of these people really know a huge amount about the company they want to work for, or what they'll be doing. They've more in common with each other than with their boss, a reclusive and wealthy weirdo scientist who's ensuring that he controls the means to life for literally the entire world. But with work as the highest good, it doesn't matter what you might have in common with those in a similar position to yourself. After all, if I'm going to win, everyone else has to lose. In Exam, characters start off sharing ideas, but as one character points out, there's only one job. And what wouldn't you do to get it? After all, a job isn't just employment. A job can be life or death. That's the whole premise of the Belko Experiment from 2017, a film which takes the themes and ideas of Exam and builds on them to underscore how the modern workplace basically depends upon the pseudo-Darwinian survival of the fittest games. The story follows Mike, who works at Belko Industries, an American corporation with offices all around the world. He's a regular guy, he does his job, spends some time flirting with a coworker that he's quite clearly got a thing for, when suddenly the windows and doors to the building are completely sealed and a mysterious voice comes over the tannoy to tell the workers inside that they have to kill one another. On top of that, the tracking devices the company has implanted in all of their American workers is not a tracker at all, but it's an explosive. So think of this film as essentially Battle Royale, but set in the Dunder Mifflin Paper Company. So almost immediately, the group of survivors splits into two. On the one hand, you have Mike and his friends, and they seem to be mostly low to mid-level office guys. There's the security guard who seems like he knows them as well, and a few other people. On the other hand, you have the senior management, the executives of the Belko Corporation, who immediately start talking about the necessity of making tough choices and being realistic. This group also almost immediately starts trying to get their hands on guns. There is a key moment where Mike, the main character, is talking to Leandra, his co-worker that he's kind of into, and she angrily tells him that his ideas of trying to work together, trying to save people, are just not realistic in a life or death situation. But throughout the film, Mike and the rest of his co-workers generally try to take care of one another, to rescue each other, whereas the senior managers and the executives of the company spend their time hunting down their less senior employees and murdering them. This reaches a high point in a pretty brutal scene where Barry Norris, the COO, the office sex pest, who's played by Dr. Cox from Scrubs, and worst of all, a British person, round up the majority of the people left in the building at gunpoint. When all of these people are shepherded down into the lobby, the COO starts to break people down into demographic groups. People over 60, those without children, and those are the ones who get shot in the back of the head. It's a pretty brutal literalization of company downsizing, and it should be taken as kind of propaganda for two things. Firstly, why unions are important, and second, the self-mythologizing rhetoric that corporate execs like to believe about themselves. Norris loves to talk about tough choices, but all of the choices he makes and all of the violence he enacts is done in the name of self-interest and securing the position of those who are most senior in the company. The Belko experiment is just the logical endpoint of corporate cost-cutting. There's a great moment towards the end of the film where Barry and Mike have their final boss fight moment, and as a corporate Belko Industries film plays and the voiceover tells you that you can take your destiny in your own hands, Mike beats Barry to death with some office supplies. What makes the Belko experiment so interesting is that it makes explicit that the office workplace makes us all into monsters. At the end of the film, Mike is the only survivor, and he finds that behind it all was an international group of social scientists who study human behavior and then adjust their managerial techniques based on what they found out. We could call this group Omnicore, the ideological representatives of managerial neoliberalism. What the organization wants is to perfect the techniques for creating a certain kind of subject, one suited for life in the corporate world. You start with someone who concentrates on trying to save their colleagues and co-workers and doesn't want to discuss the option of killing others, and you end by making them beat their boss to death with their bare hands. And how do you do this? You create an environment in which solidarity is literally impossible, and then at the end of the film, you let them out. The perfect career climbers for a globalized and corporate world. The Office makes us all monsters, but in another couple of films, we see that some of the more traditional monsters have also found a place there, and maybe in the world of alienated work, they fit in pretty well. Bloodsucking Bastards from 2015 is another film which follows a mid-level office guy, Evan. He's angling for a promotion but is caught between his co-workers and friends that he's ostensibly in charge of and the higher-ups more senior on the corporate ladder. However, instead of getting the promotion, corporate decides to bring in some execs to shake things up a bit, led by Max, played by the amazing Pedro Pascal. The new guys are, of course, vampires, and so the film unfolds. Evan has to find a way of making sure that he can get out, making sure that his love interest doesn't get turned into a vampire, making sure he can defeat Max, and, of course, seeing if he can finally leave work. Historically, the vampire was an external thing. Bram Stoker's Dracula is full of the panics of middle-class Londoners realizing that a powerful foreigner has arrived at the heart of the British Empire to buy up their property and quite literally suck the life out of people. But here they've been integrated into the system. They're internal to the functioning of the workplace. Vampires were always good capitalists, as Karl Marx knew, and so it's no surprise they've ended up as executives. And it's a funny movie. There's a great bit where Evan realizes that the reason the vampires can work during the day is that the office gets so little natural light, it doesn't bother them. And like every vampire story, it ends with the vampire always returning. So Evan and Amanda, his romantic love interest, and Tim, the office burnout stoner character, the slacker who doesn't really do anything, they have an incredibly bloody fight with Max and the rest of the vampires, and they leave behind this mountain of blood and gore for the cleaner to deal with. And of course, there's a vampire left behind too. There's just no alternative to how that could end. Talking about there being no alternative, we probably have to talk about Mayhem from 2017. It follows Derek Cho, who not only has a job that they know is pointless, but might actively be making the world worse. Derek works at TSC, or Towers Smythe Consulting, and the film opens he's getting increasingly depressed, cynical, and alienated from what he's doing. Mostly that seems to be about trying to make sure that corporations can avoid liability for things. Derek makes his name by proving in court that someone who's been infected with the red eye virus can't be held legally accountable for anything they do whilst infected. The red eye virus is something which rewires the neural pathways of the brain and turns the infected into a cross between, red-eyed rage virus fast zombies and masochistic hedonists. Obviously, the virus gets loose inside of TSC. So The film opens with Derek being fired to cover up the mistakes of his superior. Roughly around the same time, he has a meeting with a client called Melanie who's trying to save her home. This doesn't go well for either of them, and they're both locked up in security. Obviously, they both get infected, and so the film becomes not just about getting what they want, but about getting revenge. After some long and extremely entertaining fight scenes, they make it to the top of the tower. Derek's boss and the head of the company offers him full partnership in TSC Consulting. He could get everything that he ever wanted. The two fight, and the rest of the board decide to let Derek take the job as the new CEO. Living out the dream of anyone who's ever had an alienating office job, Derek punches his old boss off the top of the tower and takes over his position. He stays as CEO just long enough to help Melanie and do a few other things before quitting. Again, it's a funny film, but there's something about it which feels kind of unsatisfying. Cho basically gets to live out the liberal dream of having corporate power whilst still being a good person. Derek gets to quit, and the film ends with him happily painting with Melanie whilst telling the audience to take control over their lives. Which is, I guess, far easier to do when you've got the golden parachute of being the former CEO of Towers Smythe Consulting, and maybe a little more difficult to do if you're still stuck in a crappy office on the 3rd floor. What's notable about this kind of horror is that it tends to be horror comedy. It's funny because office life can be funny too, like the low stakes, the mundane routine, shooting the shit with your co-workers, the shared awareness of the fact that all of this is pretty much pointless. But these are horror films, and they're horror films because they make explicit what this banal, pointless, and coerced work can do to us, what it can make us do to others, and what it can make us turn into. In their book White Collar, written back in the 1950s, the sociologist C. Wright Mills talked about the Kafkaesque levels of alienation that the new office worker was feeling. They do things that they knew had no impact on the world, but that they had to pretend to love and to be invested in. We're meant to love what we do because it's through work that we find freedom, financial security, purpose. But when you stop and think about it, there's something horrifying about that. In their book, Work Won't Love You Back, Sarah Jaffe talks about the ways in which work depends upon this emotional investment on our part, and how our investment in work on an emotional level is actually depriving us of chances of finding purpose and solidarity outside of the working environment. Belko might describe itself as a family, but that simply disguises the fact that its organization is based on violence and exploitation on a global scale. And if Barry Norris decides that you're not a profitable family member anymore, he'll happily shoot you in the back of the head. It's not enough to say that the office horror is a critique of a bad job that lots of us might have experienced, but rather it's a critique of work generally. The office is a banal nightmare that can turn us into monsters, and even if we're lucky enough to escape, like Mike and Evan, we do so knowing that the systems and structures that support it are still there. Belko move on to phase 2 of their experiments. There are still vampires in the office. And TSC is still there, desperately trying to find ways to excuse more corporate evil. And as one K. Marx wrote a little while ago, the realm of freedom begins only where labour determined by necessity and expediency ends. If we understand not just the office, but work itself to be a site of horror, then these films can be more than just a cathartic expression of a shared experience that we've all had. Rather, they can be a chance to think about how important it is to strive for a world of genuine human freedom. Not one based on the banal horrors of work, but one of solidarity with each other.